For more, I want to bring in retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Foggo. Thank you so much for joining us, Admiral. Just want to first start off by getting your thoughts on the strategy. What is the strategy, do you think, behind Putin declaring a nuclear alert? And how concerned are you? We heard the president tell our Nancy Cordes there's no need for Americans to be concerned.
Well, Jericka, first of all, thanks for having me on your program this evening. And it is true that President Putin has put his nuclear forces on high alert. Now, this is not something unusual as far as the behavior of President Putin. You know, I can remember a few years ago, I just retired about a year and a half ago, we had a very successful NATO exercise in the high north. And it was good for NATO, but it didn't look great for the Russians with a large presence of forces in the Baltic Sea. And his response afterward was, well, I'm going to build more nuclear weapons for my arsenal. So it was kind of using a sledgehammer to hit a nail. This is sort of the same thing, except a lot of very smart people, including former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who I served with in the Pentagon, said yesterday that Putin's coming off the rails. So it rates watching. And I tell you, what we need to do is look for other indicators that would go along with this high alert. I'm a submariner, so is he sending his entire fleet of ballistic missile submarines to sea? If not, then this may just be another veiled threat. But we certainly have to keep our eye on it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not shocked that the president said no in reference to being concerned because, I mean, you would send an entire world, you know, concerned about a possible nuclear threat. But it is there, and that's the fact that people are talking about it is what's so scary. We've seen the images of Ukrainians fighting for their country, and Russian forces have faced more resistance, I think, than expected. What's your assessment of how this crisis has unfolded so far?
Well, it's absolutely tragic and it's terrible. And it's an egregious thing on the part of the Russians to attack a country like Ukraine, who has done nothing to deserve it. But the Ukrainians' response has been nothing short of spectacular. I attribute that to leadership from the top down. I give President Zelensky a lot of credit. You know, that guy's got guts, determination, and courage. He turned down a free ride out of there by us and asked for more ammunition. So the morale in the Ukrainian side is high because from the president on down, he stands with them. The Ukrainians have figured out, despite decapitating strikes, how to operate in a distributed manner, meaning small units out in the field. And the Russian strategy has been very poor, in my humble opinion. You know, they seem to want to drive down several roads, byways, and highways into the major cities and think that they can just waltz right in. Well, you know, you have to go back to that movie, Red Dawn, from 1984. They remade it, but the one I liked was the original with Patrick Swayze. If somebody attacked us in this country, we'd fight back, just like the Americans did in that movie, and the Ukrainians are doing the same thing. They're hitting the Russians hard. The Russians have made some fundamental errors. They do not have air superiority, and the Ukrainians are still able to fly aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles and conduct strikes on these Russian convoys. A devastating set of strikes north of Kiev yesterday and around Kharkiv. So as long as the supply lines of weapons like Javelin and Stinger and regular ammunition can flow to the Ukrainian forces, they will fight, and they will probably fight to the last man. Now, the Russians have this long convoy ready to go in to Kyiv. It's, I think it's gone from 3 miles to something like 19 miles today. That's a lot of hardware, a lot of men, and a lot of weapons. And it may be overwhelming for the Ukrainians, but boy, do they have a fighting spirit. And you know, my heart goes out to them, and I hope that they can sustain their positions for a much longer period of time.
And to that point, when you talk about Kyiv and knowing you've got nearly 3 million people, I believe, that are in that city, maybe not now because of the number of people who've left, but when you talk about them being able to sort of maintain Kyiv, when you look at the next coming days, is that an area that you'll be looking at in terms of what happens next if they're able to hold that city?
Well, Jericka, I got to tell you, this reminds me of a battle that took place about 10 years ago called Fallujah. And many of your listeners will remember that. Certainly, veterans of the Iraq campaign will remember that. That's when our Marines went in, and the first time they tried to take that very concentrated urban area, we were unable to do it. It was a failure, and they had to go back. They had to regroup and go back in. The fighting was house to house. It was brutal combat, and in some cases, hand-to-hand combat, the stuff of which movies were made about World War II, about Berlin and the siege of Berlin. Well, you know what? Kiev is going to be the same way. I mean, the 3 million inhabitants have seen what is happening in Kharkiv and other cities, and they're not happy about it. They're arming up with things like Kalashnikovs and Molotov cocktails. Kalashnikov was a Russian general, a gun maker, and Molotov was the former foreign minister of Russia. How ironic is that? These weapons are being used against the Russians. And what's terrible is this is Slavic on Slavic violence. It's two cultures that are relatively close. They even have a common language. I mean, Ukrainians speak Ukrainian, but they also speak Russian. It doesn't make any sense. And I wonder how much the morale of Russian forces can be sustained and the support of Russian forces can be sustained in what's going to turn out to be a lot of collateral damage and a lot of civilians killed.
Yeah, none of these conflicts to me happening throughout the world ever makes sense, and it's humanity at the core. Admiral James Foggo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your program.